Thank you very much for being here this evening. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm proud to direct the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. And I'm proud this evening also to say that our partner is the Cousy Business Ethics Initiative, led by Michael DeWild. We're going to be offering, I think, a great program this evening. You know, before I came over here, I just happened to look, you're constantly looking up your author, and you know, about reading the books, you're excited. But I was just curious what kind of public intellectual ranking our keynote speaker enjoys around the world. And in his field, he ranks in the top 5 in the world. So I think it's a real treat to be able to learn from him this evening. I want to thank a number of people who made this possible. Of course, I mentioned the Cousy family, but also Ralph Hallenstein, who's been such a generous donor at Grand Valley and so supportive of the programs that the Hallenstein Center has supported. Year in and year out, Ralph has been great. He was unable to make it this evening. He's almost 103 years old, and on Monday he said, I'm going to be there, but then something came up and he couldn't be here this evening. But I just think it's remarkable to be in a community, to do the work we do with somebody like Ralph Hallenstein. We're very, very fortunate here. I want to thank all the other donors who are showing such support for programs such as this, make these programs possible. We really appreciate what you do. With that, what I'd like to do is have my colleague, Michael DeWild, come forward. Michael is a philosophy professor in the philosophy department, but he's also the director, the leader of the Cousy Business Ethics Initiative, and he will introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Jeff Cousy is not 103, so I've got nothing really remarkable to say about him, except that it is the generous contribution that he and his family have made that helped make our co-sponsorship of tonight possible. So I want to thank them for that. It's always a pleasure to partner with Gleaves Whitney and the Hallenstein Center, and we're also looking forward to Dr. Fukuyama's talk. He'll be known to many of you, of course, for his work, a little book called The End of History and the Last Man. Some of you may have heard of or read. It was translated into 20 different editions all over the world. The most far-flung place I've seen it used, I stumbled across a group of students in their winter coats up in the Himalayas in northern India, poring over The End of History and the implications of Hegel for northern India. So let me get on with introducing Dr. Fukuyama. He is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, also a member of the Political Science Department there. He has, of course, written widely on issues in development and international politics. The book just before the one that most recently came out is called The Origins of Political Order. The most recent publication is Political Order and Political Decay, and as I understand it, that is the title of his talk this evening. He's also written a fair bit on biotechnology and bioethics. He has a background in classics, which is from Cornell, and a PhD from Harvard in political science. He was a member of the political science department of the RAND Corporation and the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State. He previously taught at Johns Hopkins and George Mason University before going out to Stanford. He's chairman of the editorial board of the American Interest. He's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. He's a non-resident fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Center for Global Development. He holds honorary doctorates from lots of places. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the RAND Corporation, the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, a member of the advisory boards for the Journal of Democracy, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the New America Foundation. He also serves on the Council of Foreign Relations. So with that, let me please turn it over to Dr. Fukuyama.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much. It's a very generous introduction, and I really am extremely happy to be here in Grand Rapids. It's my second visit, and I guess it's probably been 20 years since the last one. So, and I appreciate all of you coming out on a rainy night to hear me. I also today have gotten to know some of the donors of these two centers. And, Alexis de Tocqueville, the greatest observer of American democracy, said back in the early 19th century that American democracy works because of the strength of voluntary associations. And I think that the willingness of people in the community to support centers like these is a really great example of that. So I appreciate it. So thank all of you. So I am going to talk about the new book that I have embarked on. It's a 2-volume book. So the first volume, as Michael said, was the origins of political order. It's organized historically. So the first volume goes basically from primates up to the French Revolution. And the second volume carries the story forward from there. But it's actually a unified effort to talk about where basic political institutions come from. The title actually comes from my mentor, Samuel Huntington, a great political scientist who taught most of his career at Harvard University. He's well known for a book called The Clash of Civilizations, but I actually think his most important book was one that he wrote in 1968 called Political Order in Changing Societies. The bottom line of that book can be stated very simply, which is that all good things do not go together. It had been the opinion of many people in the middle of the 20th century that the process of development, that is to say, change over time, involved economic growth, the growth of individualism, cultural change, more democracy, more freedom, and that all of these things would be mutually supportive because they're all part of a big seamless modernization process. And Huntington said, no, that was not true, in fact, that some good things actually led to bad results, as when you modernized too quickly and the institutions couldn't support the kinds of demands for participation, and then you'd have what he called political decay. And in a fundamental sense, I think that the current project I'm embarked on carries forward that insight, and I'll explain the specific ways in which that's true. I think the easiest way to introduce the subject is just by looking around the world in the year 2014. Because quite frankly, this has been a pretty bad year in terms of international stability. And in fact, I can't remember a lot of previous years when you've had political disorder in so many countries simultaneously. However, the nature of that disorder is different in different parts of the world. So in Eurasia, you have a very large landmass at either end of which you've got two very powerful centralized authoritarian countries, Russia and China. Both of these countries this year are on the move. They've got territorial demands. They are causing trouble for their neighbors, and it's been a big issue for American foreign policy. But it's a very traditional kind of foreign policy issue because it's a challenge by other great powers, and that's really what the whole politics of the 19th and 20th century Europe was all about. There's another part of the world, however, that begins in North Africa, goes through sub-Saharan Africa, through the Arab world, into the greater Middle East, Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is characterized by almost the opposite. You do not have big, powerful, centralized countries there. And in fact, the big problem that we're having with terrorism is the direct result of the fact that you have weak or failing states in that entire region. And it is my opinion, we can discuss this in the Q&A period, I actually think that something like ISIS, this new group that's appeared out of the Syrian civil war and is now operating in Iraq, that we've been very preoccupied with in the last couple of months, is in itself actually not that powerful a group. I don't think it can really, in the long run, hold territory legitimately. I don't think it's a viable long-term political project. The only reason it looks very threatening is because everybody around it is so damn weak. And if you think about what's been going on with jihadism and international terrorism in the years since September 11th, it has flowed into those parts of the world that do not have organized, coherent, strong states. So it began in Afghanistan, it got pushed out of there into the tribal belt in Pakistan, It was gradually pushed out into other places like Yemen. Now they're going into the Sahel and parts of Africa like northern Nigeria, Mali, Cameroon. All of these places are unified in the fact that they do not have governments that can do the basic thing that a government is supposed to do, which is to provide security for their own populations. And that's why they are free to operate in that part of the world. And that has posed this very different kind of challenge from Russia and China. It is not a great power challenge. The challenge for American foreign policy in Afghanistan and Iraq has actually been nation building. It has been trying to build up the capacity of Iraq and Afghanistan so that they themselves could take on this basic security challenge. And the only way that we felt able to extricate ourselves from either of these countries was after this long period of great investment where we thought we had built up the states in both of those countries that they could be self-sustaining. That's when we saw fit to get out, and it turns out we didn't do a very good job, unfortunately. And we have not left, it would appear, very durable structures in either country, despite the fact that we have spent, perhaps $1 trillion and a tremendous number of shattered lives and dead Americans in these projects. So this is what I labeled in the first book, The Problem of Getting to Denmark. So Denmark in this construction is actually not the country Denmark. It's kind of a symbolic place because Denmark is democratic, prosperous, stable, and it has very, very low levels of corruption. And what we're constantly hoping in these developing countries is to turn them into some version of Denmark. We would like Haiti, Somalia, the Congo, Afghanistan, Iraq to look like Denmark, and we don't get there. This is an intellectual problem of the first order because we don't understand how Denmark itself got to be Denmark. I happen to know I had a visiting professorship at the University of Aarhus in Denmark for several years, so I spent a fair amount of time in that country. And I can guarantee that the Danes themselves have no idea how they got to be Denmark, I mean, 800 years ago, they were ferocious Vikings that were spearing little babies for fun, and now they're, peaceful social democrats, and that's a pretty big, that's a pretty big transformation. And so, as a political scientist, it seemed to me there ought to be a place you could go to find out, where did Denmark come from, or where did the state come from, or where did the rule of law come from, where did democracy come from? Because there are many places in the world where these things don't exist, and it would be nice to have someone explain how these things came into being, but there weren't. And that I found rather surprising, so I figured I would write the book myself. So that was really kind of the origins of this project. Now, I need to set the stage a little bit in terms of some basic definitions because we need to understand what political order is all about. And in my view, political order necessarily rests on one of three, it rests on three pillars, not all of which are present in all societies, all right? So the first pillar is the state. The state, I believe, is about power. The state is about the ability to generate power, to use it to enforce laws, to provide basic public services like security, education, health. It's to defend the community against hostile threats from the outside. So the state is really about the concentration and the use of power. The second pillar is the rule of law. Now, law exists in virtually all societies, and in many societies, it's basically just a command of the ruler, which I would call rule by law, not rule of law. Rule by law becomes rule of law when it becomes binding on the most powerful individuals in the particular society. So if the king or the prime minister or the president can make up the rules as they go along, that is not the rule of law. The rule of law has to be a constraint on the most powerful people in the society. And in that respect, it pulls in exactly the opposite direction from the state. The state is about building up and using power, and the rule of law is about constraining power. It's about making sure that power is used in a transparent way in accord with the values and norms of the broad society. The third pillar is democratic accountability, which we in the West today understand as free and fair multi-party elections. I think there's actually a difference between substantive and procedural accountability. We tend to associate democracy very much with the procedural, the procedures that we think will lead to, or we hope will lead to substantive accountability. But what substantive accountability is about is just that the government ought to respond to the needs of the whole community and not just to the needs of the elite or the people that are actually running the government. That's what accountability is about, and there's supposed to be, and I think usually is, an overlap between the substantive and the procedural versions of this. So in a modern liberal democracy, you hopefully have these three pillars or components of political order in some kind of a balance, and they push in opposite directions. So as I said, the state is about using and concentrating power. The rule of law and democratic accountability are both institutions that constrain power. If you have one without the other, you do not have a balanced system and you do not have a good political order. So, for example, if you have democratic elections, constraints on power, but the state is weak and unable to provide basic security for its citizens, you have Libya or Syria or Somalia or some other place where anybody with an AK-47 can put together a militia, grab whatever property they want, and keep order for themselves. So that's not a good situation for any society to be in. On the other hand, if you have a state that uses power but there are no institutions of constraints, you have a tyranny. And that's pretty much the situation of China. So China would be at the opposite end. They've had a very powerful centralized state for thousands of years, but they do not have the rule of law, and they do not have, obviously, democratic accountability, and that's not a good situation either. So what you want ultimately is balance. In every country in the world, you can characterize their political system as having some combination of these three institutions. So Singapore, for example, has a very strong state. It has a British-derived rule of law, but very limited political accountability. A country like Afghanistan has elections or election-like events periodically, which provide some degree of democratic legitimacy, but they do not have a strong rule of law, and they have an extremely weak state, and so on and so forth. Now, there's one further definition. So you have to excuse all these definitions, but I'm a political scientist, and this is what we do, is we try to clarify things by creating these different categories. But I think this is actually a very important conceptual distinction. There's a difference between a modern state and what was called by the sociologist Max Weber a patrimonial state, or we might say a neo-patrimonial state. So a modern state is a state that is impersonal in the sense that your relationship to the state does not depend on whether you are a personal friend or family member of the ruler. The state endeavors to treat everybody as citizens because they are citizens in a particular territory. In a modern state, there's a clear distinction between public and private. And so the government exists to serve the public interest of the whole society and not the private interest of the ruler. And therefore, you have a phenomenon, you can have a phenomenon known as corruption, in which public resources are diverted to the pockets of public officials, and the distinction between public and private breaks down, all right? So that's a modern state. That's what a modern state is supposed to do. A patrimonial state is a state in which the government is regarded as a species of private property. That's why you use the term patrimonial, because in the old days when you actually had kings and queens, the king could take a province and give it to his daughter as a wedding present, along with all of the people living in that particular territory, because basically the king owned everything. Now today there are no rulers that dare get up and say, I own this particular country and I can do whatever I want with it. There are some companies that are treated that way, but not countries. And so, therefore, political scientists use this term neo-patrimonial to describe what's substantively the same thing. And in a neo-patrimonial country, essentially you've got a ruling elite that regards the state and the government as a type of private property that can be exploited for their own private benefit. All right? And I would say that that kind of state, that kind of, and by the way, these neo-patrimonial states, on the outside, they all have parliaments and bureaucracies and presidents, and they look as if they're modern states. But the reality is, in fact, they're just a kind of insider clique for sharing the resources of that society. And that's why they're called neo-patrimonial. And I would say that although we as Americans typically like to divide the world up into authoritarian versus democratic states, that the reality is that the distinction between patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states on the one hand and modern states on the other is one of the central dividing lines in world politics today, and in fact is displacing the democratic authoritarian divide as a central issue in global politics. And that's one of the ways that the world has changed very much, I think, since 1989. All right, I'll give you several examples of this. Begin with Ukraine, which has been in the news a lot earlier this year. The Ukraine, what was the struggle in Ukraine all about? Why were these young protesters in Maidan Square? So they had elected Viktor Yanukovych president in a free and fair election. But the trouble with Viktor Yanukovych was that he was one of these neo-patrimonial rulers. I don't know if you watched at the time of his ouster back in February, but it turned out after he left that he was building this monstrous palace for himself outside of Kiev. He had sent billions of dollars out of the country, public funds, basically to his family members. And the entire government was basically an insider clique that was milking the country for as much money as possible. And for all of those young protesters in Maidan Square, the issue for them, what they meant when they said they wanted to be associated with the European Union and not with Russia, the Russian Federation, was they wanted to live in a modern country. They wanted to live in a country where the distinction between public and private was a bright line, and the government was really supposed to be serving public interests, and that they were not living in that kind of country. It was not democracy because those protesters acknowledged that Yanukovych had been elected in a pretty free and fair election. And if you think, really, what's the argument between us and Vladimir Putin, in Russia? Again, it is not democracy because, I think everybody acknowledges if an election were held in Russia tomorrow, he would probably win by 60, 70% of the vote. He's very popular in that country. The real issue, the real beef that we have with him is that he is running one of these corrupt insider rings. He's using Russian nationalism as a means of maintaining popular support, but the reality of that regime is the private appropriation of public funds. Now, that's one set of conflicts, but I think there are big problems inside of existing democracies, and that's one of the reasons that democracy does not seem to be doing that well in many parts of the world in the year 2014. India has been a very successful democracy ever since its founding in the late 1940s. It's actually remarkable that they've kept that thing going as a pretty lively democracy with a free press, lots of opposition parties, and so forth. But the ability of that government to actually produce results that Indian citizens want is very lacking. In the late 1990s, there was an economist named Jean Drèze who did a survey of some poor states in northern India, and he discovered that 50% of all the school teachers who were being paid to be public school teachers in those states did not show up for work on a day-to-day basis. They just didn't show up. And there's a big outcry in the very free and lively Indian press. A lot of people were rightly outraged. There was absolutely no disagreement from anybody in that entire political system that this was a terrible thing to happen. There was a lot of reform efforts. 10 years later, they did another survey, and they found that exactly the same percentage, 50% of teachers were not showing up for work. So this is one of the most basic functions that a government can provide is basically, the education of its children. This is hurting Indian competitiveness. It is increasing the already great levels of inequality in Indian society because it's primarily the children of the poor that are not being educated. And despite the fact that there is democratic accountability and an open media and everything else, this seems to be a problem that was beyond the capability of the Indian government to solve. Earlier this year, they elected Narendra Modi as the new prime minister, and I think part of the reason that they have such high hopes in this gentleman is that they want a strong government. You know, they are tired of this feckless democracy that cannot make decisions and seems to be paralyzed in producing, you know, the basic goods that a government is supposed to provide, like education. We'll see how he works out, but, you know, I actually hope that they succeed. Another example, Nigeria. So Nigeria is another country that has these election-like events periodically. As you probably are aware, it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. They have a public utility, like many countries do, called the Nigerian Electric Power Authority. It's a state-owned utility. They've been trying to privatize it very unsuccessfully. Nigerians say the initials NEPA actually stand for no electric power anytime, because this utility is just, you know, so this is a country that produces oil. You know, they got tons of oil in the country. They've not been able to refine that oil for their own use, and they cannot run an electric utility that can produce reliable power. So your businessman in Lagos, you know, in the afternoon, randomly the power will go out. So you have to maintain a backup generator, which costs a lot of money. It pollutes a great deal. And this is all the failure of a government to provide this very basic public service. Final example is closer to home. Why did Greece get into so much trouble during the recent euro crisis? So part of it had to do with the bad design of the euro and of the EU in general. But part of it was really on the part of the Greeks, because they were running very large public deficits. And they were not sustainable, and that's why their banks started to collapse in 2010. Why were they running these big deficits? Well, Greece was ruled by these colonels in a very nasty dictatorship up until 1974. Democracy was restored, and there's been actually pretty healthy democracy in Greece with two big parties, PASOK, the left-wing party, and New Democracy, the right-wing one, trading power the way that democracies are supposed to every few years. The problem in Greece was that the way that these parties achieved power was through patronage, that basically they would give out jobs in the government to their supporters, and because you couldn't fire any civil servants in Greece, every time there was a change of parties, the government would get larger because the incoming party would stock the bureaucracy, you know, the teachers and bank workers and so forth, with their own workers, with the result that by the 2000s, Greece had something like 7 times the per capita number of civil servants that Britain did. And that's one of the reasons they couldn't control their wage bill, and that's one of the reasons that you know, their currency tanked. And so, again, democracy is not necessarily the solution to these problems of poor governance. There's something else involved that is necessary to have a successfully operating system. Now, why do you get into these kinds of problems, especially the kind of problem that Greece had with political patronage? This is a characteristic of very many democratic countries in the developing world. So Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, India, all of them are plagued with this kind of problem, and that's one of the reasons that their governments are so ineffective. I think a lot of people in the West tend to look down on them, and they say, oh, these people just don't understand what good government is like. What's wrong with them? You know, why are they so, you know, dysfunctional? And I think that the problem is that Americans do not understand their own history, because I actually think that the reason that you get patronage is not because people are culturally corrupt. It is because you had a poor sequencing of the introduction of democracy, and that actually this kind of patronage ought to be considered an early manifestation of democratic mobilization. And the proof of the pudding is really the United States itself, because this is exactly what happened in 19th century America. That story really begins in 1828 with the election of 1828 that brought Andrew Jackson to power. So Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a Boston Brahmin. His father was the second president of the United States. He was from Massachusetts. He went to Harvard University. He traveled extensively in Europe. He could speak European languages. Andrew Jackson was really the fountainhead of a populist tradition in the United States. He was born in Frontier, Tennessee. He didn't have much by way of a formal education. He was a drinker, a brawler, an Indian fighter, and the victor of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, which catapulted him to national fame. And so this was one of these long-standing polarities in American politics, very much like, the Boston Brahmin John Kerry versus, let's say Sarah Palin, who basically, she's got a certain point. She thinks that elites in the United States, you shouldn't have to go to Harvard and Yale to run the United States. And in fact, Andrew Jackson, when he was elected and when he defeated John Quincy Adams, said exactly that. He said, I won the election, therefore I should appoint who works for the U.S. government. And secondly, he didn't put it in quite these terms, but he said, in effect, it doesn't take a genius to be a bureaucrat or be a public official. And this is what begins a 100-year period in which virtually every public office in the United States was awarded not on the basis of merit and qualifications, but on the basis of a political payoff by some politician to some loyal political supporter, known as the spoils system or the patronage system. And it had plenty of local manifestations, Tammany Hall and the Daily Machine in Chicago and so on and so forth. And so this is one of those cases where Huntington was actually right that the good things in development don't necessarily go together. And in this case, I think the early introduction of democracy actually weakened the quality of state administration because it opened up the system to this kind of political patronage. Now, the question for the United States back in the 19th century and for many developing countries today is, how do you get out of this? Unfortunately, one of the routes for getting out of it is one that I wouldn't recommend any country take, and that's to fight incessant wars for a couple hundred years. And this actually was what happened in China. If you read the first volume of my book, why is it that the Chinese were the inventors of modern government or the modern state back in the 3rd century BC? It's because they went through a 500-year period of incessant warfare, and warfare really concentrates the mind. If you're hiring a corrupt general who happens to be your cousin or brother-in-law, but they don't know how to run a military campaign, you're going to be exterminated along with the rest of your family. And so military competition creates incentives for meritocracy, for qualifications that were very important. And this is the story in a lot of modern countries like Prussia that then became the nucleus of modern Germany, Japan, Sweden. There are a number of societies that went through this. This is not, however, a path that I would recommend any country to take. Nobody wants to have Germany's history of, unification and then 2 world wars as a result of this kind of militarism. The other path, however, is a democratic one, and that's the one that the United States took. And I think this is actually the model that's out there for many developing countries today. So what happened in the United States was that democracy healed itself. Democracy created the problem, but democracy was also the solution. In the late 19th century, in the decades after the Civil War, the country was changing enormously. It had been a rural agrarian society, everybody, the vast bulk of the population living on family farms. But with the rise of telegraph and railroads, which were the cutting-edge technologies of that period, country was knit into a single national market. Scale increased. There was a lot of urbanization, a lot of change in the social structure of the United States with workers, with a new middle class, with professionals, with social activists, with a lot more educated professional people in the country. And it was that social group that led a grassroots movement that wanted to basically reform the civil service. And there's a lot of moralism about this. I was talking about this with Gleaves yesterday, that actually Calvinism played a certain role in this because there was a great moralism. A lot of the old Protestant elites in the country saw the cities filling up with these Italian Catholics and Irish and Jews that were all part of these big patronage machines. And there's a lot of, just moral indignation that your fourth-class postmaster was some political hack who was put in place by another political hack, and therefore a lot of grassroots civil society activism to change the system. The other thing that they had in this period was a lot of top-down, good leadership from people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was actually one of the early heads of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, Gifford Pinchot, the head of the U.S. Forest Service, Woodrow Wilson, who was a professor of public administration at Johns Hopkins before he went into politics. And then finally there was a catalyzing event that brought all of this together, which was the assassination of James Garfield so Garfield had been elected in 1882. He was shot by a would-be office seeker, a guy named Charles Guiteau, who thought he should be the consul general to France, didn't get the job and was really mad. So he shoots the president. He takes about 6 very painful weeks to die. And at that point, absolutely nobody in Congress had an interest in having a modern civil service, a modern merit-based civil service, because they had all benefited from the patronage system. But it took this event to shake everybody loose and to embarrass Congress into passing something called the Pendleton Act in 1883, which established the first U.S. Civil Service Commission, created a civil service examination, and really put the U.S. government, the federal government, on a more modern basis. And then, a lot of the 20th century history was on a city-by-city basis, fighting these political machines, trying to replace, corrupt mayors with city managers, with, a more professional layer of government, to the point where, I think that movement really by the 1920s had succeeded in significantly modernizing the quality of American democracy. And so democracy created the initial problem, but democracy under different socioeconomic conditions was also the route away from the problem. Now, I want to end by talking about the question of political decay, which I think has been central to the Hauenstein Center and a lot of the concerns that a lot of Americans have, because I think that in this reform movement that began in the 1880s, we got rid of a certain overt form of corruption, but because I believe that in a way corruption is sort of endemic to human nature, you keep the thief from coming in the front door, and so he keeps trying to figure out other ways of getting in through the basement window or the back door. And I think we've now, in a certain way, repatrimonialized a good part of the American government. And this, I think, has led to what I label political decay. So I want to make a couple of things clear at the outset. I do not think that American civilization is in decline, as some people do. I actually think that American government was never the best thing necessarily about the country, that it was really the private sector and voluntary associations that people did on their own that was really the core of what made the United States such a vibrant civilization. And I think that's still there. There's a huge amount of entrepreneurship and innovation going on in the United States in energy and in high tech and biomedicine and so forth. And that stuff is still going strong. The problem is in, I think, the U.S. government. And I think the problem is the intersection of a couple of different factors. So one of those factors is certain social changes that have been taking place. One has to do with the rise of interest groups. A pluralistic democracy is supposed to have interest groups, so there's no question that they're legitimate at some basic level. But with the growth of money in politics and with the growth of a science of knowing how to organize interest groups and to manipulate electorates and so forth, there's been this just unbelievable proliferation of essentially K Street lobbyists who I think collectively do not represent the public. They represent people that have resources and are well organized and can make strong arguments, but collectively they fail in a representative function. The other thing that's been going on is the steady polarization in American society. So in Congress, for example, you had a substantial overlap for much of the 20th century between the two political parties. But this is one thing that political scientists can actually measure pretty well. Today, two parties are completely split. So the most liberal Republican is now considerably more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. Now, this would not be a big problem that you have got two very ideological opposed parties. That's the way parties work in a lot of Europe, where you've got very ideology-based parties and parliamentary systems. The problem is when those two phenomena, the rise of interest groups and polarization, meet with our particular institutional situation. The Founding Fathers wrote a constitution that wanted to maximize individual liberty, and it grew out of a very deep American tradition of distrust of centralized authority. That was what the whole Revolutionary War against the English monarchy and Parliament was all about. And in order to guarantee individual liberty, they created a very complex system of checks and balances in which different parts of the government would oppose other parts of the government to make sure that no single part of the government became too centralized and overweening that it threatened individual liberty. And by and large, they were very successful, and that system has served us very well. But when it meets up with the social changes and the changes in the political class that have been happening over the past generation, it has very deleterious effects. And I think, the way I put it in my book is that the system of checks and balances has evolved into something I call a vetocracy, meaning rule by veto. I mean, the American system is very good at privileging well-organized minorities and allowing them to use their influence to stop things that are against their interest, and therefore blocking things that may be in a more general interest that in a parliamentary system would be relatively easy to do. So there are many examples of this. Let's just begin with budgeting. I think that budgeting is one of the most basic functions of any government. And Congress has not passed a budget since 2008, by its own rules. Last year we had a complete shutdown of the federal government, and a lot of Americans are not aware of this, but under American law, actually, if you had gone to work as a federal employee during the shutdown, it would have been a criminal offense. And so this is a very strange way to run a government. If you look again at the tax code, we had a discussion about this at lunch. So the corporate tax rate, about 35%, is very high compared to other industrialized countries. But many corporations have managed to negotiate special subsidies or exemptions so that a lot of them don't actually pay anything close to that rate. And this is why I think this is a case of decay. So I gave several examples in the first volume of the book of earlier political systems that had decayed because they were captured by very powerful elites. This happened in the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century China, where this modern bureaucratic government was basically captured by very powerful families. It happened, so the Ottomans the Ottomans had this very interesting and bizarre system for getting to modern government. They existed in the Middle East, which is intensely tribal, and one of the big conflicts is between your family ties and your ties to an impersonal state. The way they solved it was by going into the Balkans, capturing Christian boys and basically taking them to Istanbul and raising them as slaves to be generals, administrators, grand viziers that ran the Ottoman Empire. And that was the only way that they could, break their ties to their families and make them loyal just to the Ottoman state itself. And that system began to break down when those children, when those Janissaries began to have children. They at first weren't allowed to have children because they wanted to prevent nepotism, but over time they began clamoring to have families and then turning over their positions to their families. Another example of this was in the French old regime. The French government was so broke back then under these great kings, Louis XIII, Louis XIV. If you go to Versailles, it's a magnificent palace, but it meant that the French government couldn't pay its bills in order to support that kind of a lifestyle. So what did they do? They sold off public offices to rich individuals in a practice called venal office holding, so that you could buy the position of treasurer of France that would give you the right to collect taxes and use the money for your own purposes. And not only that, you could turn this office over to your children as part of their patrimony. when you died, right? So this is kind of the ultimate, form of corruption. That's one of the reasons that the French Revolution happened. So I'm not saying that the U.S. Congress is quite as bad as that, but I do think that we are facing, in a certain sense, a repatrimonialization where we've forgotten what the difference between liberty and privilege is. A liberty is freedom from government action that applies to everybody equally as citizen. A privilege is an exemption from government interference that only applies to me or my family or my company. And I think that we all clamor and we all say that we want liberty, but a lot of us have unfortunately been willing to settle for privilege. And that's why you get this situation where you can't reform the tax code, where I think many people would say it would make much more sense to lower the tax rate, make it much more competitive, and then just get rid of all of the special tax breaks and exemptions. But this is where vetocracy comes into play, where it is very easy for a very well-organized interest group to stop action that hurts its particular concentrated interest, that something that might make sense from the standpoint of a public interest, essentially cannot get through Congress. I mean, so people have been saying 2 days after the election that maybe tax reform is one of the things that might happen in the last 2 years of the Obama administration. I'm not holding my breath, basically. So this is, I think this is an important issue internationally, because I think that what happens in the United States is actually very important for global democracy. The United States has always been a model. So we're 25 years, we're going to hit the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And a lot has changed, unfortunately, for the worse in that 25 years, because at the moment that the wall fell, I think that, many people around the world would have looked to the United States as the model for a rich, successful, democratic country. And now you've got China with an alternative authoritarian model that continues to power ahead. And I think, quite frankly, looking at a lot of people that are not anti-American, I mean, they're sympathetic to the United States and they want it to do well. But these days, it's really hard, for them to say, yeah, you ought to be, you developing country ought to be like Washington is now, with all of your lobbyists and money and, paralyzed government and so forth. And so I don't think that there's actually a generic crisis of democracy. I think there's some democracies around the world that are actually functioning pretty well. But, there's some that are doing less well. It's not a problem that is unfixable. The big argument in favor of democracy is that it can heal itself, because ordinary people don't have an interest in dysfunctional government. They can use their power at the ballot box to elect a different set of leaders that will do things better. I think for various reasons that we can discuss in the Q&A, that hasn't really been happening all that effectively in the current American political system. But I think the thing to remember is that there's no automatic mechanism that guarantees that this will happen, that you'll get the right leaders, that they'll make the right arguments that will convince people to follow them, and that there'll be, the mass support for the kinds of changes that need to be made. But I think that that's an important issue, because right now there are people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping who are getting up there and saying, look, our authoritarian systems are on the move. We're able to plow ahead. We're able to grow economically and do a lot of things. And look at the United States and Europe. They're wallowing in stagnation, high unemployment, unhappy politics, and we're the model for the future. I do not believe this for a minute. I really do not believe this for a minute. But unless I think we fix certain things, that argument is going to seem plausible to other people around the world. And that's the way in which I think our domestic politics actually joins up with some of these larger trends in global politics. So with that, I think I will stop talking, and thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any comments or questions that you have. Thank you very much. Is there a microphone or for people asking questions? No, okay. Sir.
pharmaceutical medicine and everything.
Yeah.
And, he makes the point that when empires or civilizations, when they unravel, quite often unravel very quickly. And the things that you're talking about, seems to me that there is enormous economic pressure on the federal government, state governments. Nobody wants to pay taxes. Everybody's looking for a free lunch. It can't last. How do you see I just see it as a real danger for the future of this country unless we come to grips with it, because how are we going to pay for all this stuff?
Yeah. Well, so it's a complicated issue in the short run, because actually, our deficit now, the CBO is now, measured that it's fallen below 3% of GDP, having peaked at, more like 10% right after the crisis. And so actually economic growth is the most efficient way to get out of this bind. But it is certainly true that another 10 or 15 years down the road, as baby boomers age, that the current path that we're on is clearly unsustainable. So this is why I think that this issue of vetocracy is so important. Traditionally, conservatives have liked the fact that there's a lot of these vetoes, because this is why the American welfare state has been smaller than its counterparts in Europe. It's just very hard to pass legislation in the United States, particularly broad, sweeping social legislation. And that's why, virtually every other advanced democracy had a universal health care system. Most of them were put in place early in the 20th century, and ours was not passed until, the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And part of the reason is precisely because of this system of checks and balances. It makes it hard to pass complex legislation like that. But the thing that I think we got to keep in mind is that those same checks and balances are going to keep us from doing entitlement reform down the road. And in fact, that's going to be an even more difficult problem, because there you got precisely this problem. You can't do entitlement reform without taking away entitlements. I think without some combination of tax increases and then, pretty severe cuts in benefits. And that's where vetocracy really makes a big difference, because that's where, concentrated minorities of people can block the government from making decisions that are bad for their interests. And therefore, I think that it's not just that in general democracies don't like to take tough decisions. I mean, that's actually not a universal rule. I mean, there's a lot of, Sweden, Germany, Denmark, a lot of countries in Europe actually made very tough decisions in the past couple of decades to open up their labor markets and make them more flexible, to actually cut back a lot of benefits. So the welfare state in Scandinavia is considerably smaller than it was 20 years ago. So democracies are capable of doing this, but this is where I think these specific institutional rules that we have are really going to be a problem. And I don't really see how you can address the fiscal sustainability problem without actually fixing the institutional rules under which we make these kinds of decisions. Yes, how about there? In the white shirt, yeah.
Are there any historical examples of successful nation building? And if not, what does that mean for the work in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Successful nation building, yeah, so there's actually a whole section of my new book on this subject. So the most successful cases are when an outside power occupies a lightly inhabited territory, wipes out all the indigenous inhabitants, and settles it with its own people. And so this is the story of North America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Argentina, and so forth. So there is one unambiguously successful case of that. If you look at other parts of the world where countries have left institutions, it usually exists in places where the outside power has been willing to stay for a very, very long time. So the British were in India for more than 200 years, and at the end of that, they left behind an army, a civil service, a system of law, a lot of institutions that are really the basis of Indian government today, or Hong Kong and Singapore, which were much more tractable because they're so small, and the British could actually do things. But our problem is that we do not have the patience to do anything like this, and American taxpayers are just not willing to, invest the sums that are necessary. So I would say that in a typical American intervention in a troubled country, our attention span is about 5 years. It's like 1 year longer than one presidential cycle. So some president decides that they're going to occupy Haiti or Somalia or Afghanistan or, Vietnam. And about 5 years later, we say, hey, this is really costly. We're losing good people. We're paying a lot of money for this. They're still corrupt. We've not really changed the institutions. And then we say, okay, let's get out. Now, Afghanistan, I would say, we actually, to our credit, we stayed a lot longer than 5 years. But that 5-year cycle was exactly what operated in Iraq. I mean, we decided to get out after 5 years. We decided to get out after 5 years in Vietnam. And so under these circumstances, I sort of think we shouldn't go into these places in the first place, because you can shape institutions in countries like this, but it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of staying power, and it also takes a lot of knowledge. You got to learn the language, you got to learn all the local customs. We're not, really good at doing that sort of thing. Sir. My opinion about income inequality. Well, I actually think that the kind of eroding position of the middle class and income inequality is probably the central issue that our democracy is going to have to confront. It's not just our democracy. I mean, I think all countries, democratic or not, are going to have to confront this. I think the reasons that it's increasing really have to do with factors that we don't have very much control over, particularly the spread of technology. I have a venture capitalist friend, so I live in Silicon Valley, and my friend said, everybody in Silicon Valley stays up 24/7 trying to figure out how to destroy jobs in the rest of the country. Because, that's what smart machines do. They displace low-skill work. So you think about something like the Google self-driving car, which will probably be great if you want to ride in a car. But you think of how many low-skilled people get their start or get, enough money to support a family because they're drivers, And once that whole category of jobs goes away, what are they going to do? They're not going to be geneticists or computer programmers. And so I think that, and I actually think that this erosion of the middle class, so, Aristotle, among other people, said that, a broad middle class is really important to sustain a democracy, and I think that's actually quite true. If you have a highly polarized society with a lot of people that aren't doing well and a very small number of, people that are doing well, that's historically Latin America. Latin America's been like that right from the beginning, and that's why you have this crazy populist politics in that part of the world. And I think that that's something that, we might see growing up in Europe and in the United States if you don't somehow address this problem. And I think you already see the beginnings of this, because you do see populist parties in all of these places who I think are incredibly, the social base are people that have been displaced by all of the changes going on in the global economy. They're very worried, anxious for their children, and the political system is not providing them clear solutions to the problem. I don't have a solution. I wish I did. There's a list of policy recommendations that people that look at this issue, can run off. What worries me is that collectively, either we won't be able to get to them, or they're, in the end, not going to be sufficient. But it is going to be a real problem, I think, for the future of democracy. How about in the front here?
Have you changed your mind about the end of history?
Well, you have to understand what the end of history was about. The end of history was not the termination of history, it was the direction of history. So the end of history, the concept comes out of this Hegelian Marxist tradition, and it's basically a question about modernization. What is the direction, end in the sense of direction, that history is going? And the communists had one answer, or Karl Marx had one answer. It's the end of history will be communism. It'll be a communist utopia. And all I said back in 1989 was it didn't look like we were going to get there. That to the extent that, countries were evolving towards a certain kind of political system, it looked like it was going to be liberal democracy and a market economy. And I think that's still true. So between 1970 and 2014, the number of democracies in the world has gone from about 35 to about 110, 115, depending on how you count them. So, 2/3 of the world is living under some form of democratic government. And so I would say that, it's still a pretty important, viable goal that a lot of countries are working their way towards. That's why I think China is actually an important country, because I don't think that some Islamic republic is the future of anybody. I don't think that that's a viable alternative. But China is, because they can master technology. They're likely to have the largest economy in the world, at a certain point. And they're not democratic. And so I think if my thesis is proven wrong, or I would be very happy to admit to you that in another generation, if China is really moving ahead of the United States and is looked up to by many countries around the world, and we are not, I would say the thesis was completely wrong. But at the moment, I don't think the results are in yet. Let's see. How about let's go to this side here.
You say that democracy is self-healing. How do you think gerrymandering affects that, and do you have any proposed solutions for that, and might one of them be instant runoff elections?
Huh. Good. Well, I didn't say that. I said the theory is that democracy is self-healing. But whether it actually happens depends on a lot of other factors, and I don't think you can take that for granted. So that's why I think we've got a problem. So gerrymandering is a problem. It is crazy that we let the political parties redistrict. In most other countries with single-member districts where redistricting is an issue, it's almost always done by a nonpartisan commission. And that's what I think we ought to do in this country. We ought to, and actually we did this by referendum in California, so now California is now redistricted by a nonpartisan commission. And it just seems to me a pretty obvious thing, but this is a case where the entrenched parties just do not want to give up this, this ability. Although I would say that it's not going to solve the problem, because the Senate is just as polarized as the House, and they don't redistrict the Senate. Instant runoff elections or the alternative vote, I have a colleague in my center at Stanford, Larry Diamond, who's been a big advocate of this. So essentially this is a kind of, it's the ballot that the Australians use, where you don't vote for just one candidate, but you vote for a list in rank order preference. And this solves the Ralph Nader problem in Florida in 2000, where it's very hard to vote for a third-party candidate in this country because you're likely to actually damage your second favorite candidate. But in a rank order system, if in Florida in 2000, if you'd had the same vote under that system, Ralph Nader would have been struck from the ballot because he came in third, and his votes would have been allocated to the second choice, and then Gore would have won that election. It makes it much easier for third parties to challenge the hegemony of the two existing parties. And so they've done it in Oregon and in Oakland and in certain municipalities. I think it's a good idea, but again, this is the problem with all political reform. The two parties don't want this. They don't want to give up their ability to redistrict, because that's how they keep themselves in power. And so you got to come up with a strategy that persuades people that this is, something desirable. Yes, sir.
There are Muslim groups of people in lots of different places that have respect for neighbors and people
Yeah.
of other persuasions. And why have they been so slow to speak out against the radical Muslims who seem to have no respect for life in their terrorist activities?
That's a question that I don't really know the answer to. I think that there's just been this momentum in that part of the world where the more radical people have held the upper hand for some time because there is a general feeling, it's a mixture of anti-Americanism and resentment, or even in countries that, get a lot of aid from the United States, like Pakistan, and are not, congenitally anti-American, they still think that we're too high-handed and so forth. And so, they hear these more radical people and, they feel, on the one hand, well, that's bad because I don't like their agenda, but on the other hand, stick it to them, or, stick it to the man, basically. So I think that what's got to happen in that part of the world is unfortunately a very long and slow evolution. So what I think is going on in the greater Middle East is that there is a spreading Sunni-Shiite civil war that's now taking place, and it's being backed by Saudi Arabia and Iran, and who are using proxies, but it's not essentially a contest between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, these are between populations in all of these countries. So in the Christian West was not born with liberal pluralism and tolerance. Protestants and Catholics fought, from the period after the Reformation up until 1648, 150 years of unremitting religious warfare. And the reason we have modern liberalism and the doctrine of religious tolerance is that at the end of this period, so the 30 Years' War killed, a third of the population of Germany, right? So at the end of this period, you get these liberal thinkers that get up and say, this is crazy, if our politics is organized according to religious preferences and arguments over the good life, we're going to not be able to keep our lives, themselves, and that's why you get people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and a lot of other, early modern theorists that said what you need is to keep religion out of the political sphere altogether, make it a private matter, and everybody should just, get along. And I think, unfortunately, what may have to happen in the Muslim world is that they're going to have to fight this thing out. Hopefully it's not going to take as long as it did in Europe for them to reach the conclusion that maybe some, a kind of tolerant, pluralistic society is better than, incessant religious warfare. But unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of those societies are there yet. Yes.
Thank you for everything you shared. Comment and a question. Could perhaps vetocracy and things like redistricting be creating a patrimonial tier within our country by default? America is not the first country that's been drawn into unremitting war. There's historical evidence that goes back many, many years on that one. I guess my question is, what would you estimate to be our economic reliance today on conducting the wars for the last 30 or 40 years? How dependent are we on maintaining a disproportionately applied wealth profile on the income that feeds our economy through the making of weapons and the expending of ordnance?
I don't think that that's an important factor, quite honestly. I think that our level of defense spending has actually reflected our perception of what the external threat was. So, in the immediate post-Cold War period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our defense spending just dropped like a rock because we didn't see an external threat. And so, at the end of the Cold War, we had 7 big prime defense contractors, and they all, had to consolidate into 3 because they just didn't have the revenue base to support that. And the reason that defense spending went up again in the 2000s was after September 11th, we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and, we just had more military activity. But we didn't invade those countries because of pressure from defense contractors. We did it because we thought, mistakenly, I think, in the case of Iraq, but we thought that there was a threat there. So I actually don't think that that's, it's an important lobby. You cannot procure a major weapons platform like the F-35 or the F-22 without spreading it across, 35 different states, because that's how you build the coalition to keep these programs alive, and that's why you can never kill one of these major weapon systems. So there's aspects of it that do distort our policy making, but I don't think that the economy per se really depends on this very much. I think if you want to look at distortive, powerful interest groups, you do much better to look at Wall Street, because I think that's really where the money and the power are right now in the United States. Yes. And then we'll go to...
I'm just curious, what role do you feel that non-government organizations play along the terms of political decay? Do you feel that they have a chance at staying or slowing it, or are they ultimately teethless against it?
Well, this is actually a very complicated question, because in many respects, as I said at the outset of the lecture, there's this long tradition that starts with Tocqueville and goes through contemporary political scientists like Robert Putnam that says that non-governmental organizations are really the necessary bulwark of democracy, and they're the ones that organize weak individuals and turn them into political players. And there's no doubt that that is the case. The difficult issue that I try to wrestle with in this book is that at a certain point, a non-governmental organization can shift over from being, a way of projecting collective social interests into the political system to being an interest group that then distorts, the decision-making process, and in a curious way actually makes the whole political system less accountable rather than more. I'll just give you an example of that. I mean, if you look at spending, healthcare reform and medical spending, right now every single disease known to man has got a very powerful interest group organized around it. And the decisions on how you allocate money, for combating different diseases oftentimes do not reflect the professional view of doctors or medical researchers. They reflect how well these groups are organized and how much funding they've got, and so forth. The other issue has to do with the fact that even to know what government is today is very hard, because so much of government is actually delivered through NGOs or private organizations of different sorts. And people may not realize this because they think that government's been getting larger inexorably, but actually the total number of federal workers was capped by Congress in the 1950s. It reached its peak of about 2.5 million in the 1960s, and it's now declined to about 1.5 million, and it basically hasn't increased for the last 25 years. But government has grown, and the responsibilities of government have grown enormously, and it's grown basically through contractors, some of which are faith-based organizations, NGOs, nonprofits. Others are for-profit, firms like Blackwater and so forth. And there is something problematic about delivering so much of the government through things that are not directly democratically accountable, to the people through their elected representatives. So I think on the whole, yes, civil society is an important bulwark of democracy, and it's really important in holding the government accountable, but at a certain point it can also become, part of the problem. So we had a question down in the front here.
I'm curious, a couple of weeks ago we had a person standing where you are, and one of the problems that he brought up was the aging of the world. Mm-hmm. And what it meant to China and Japan, yes, and us, and he picked out Japan and said, right, they're over the hill. They're gone as a country. So what's your opinion about how we stand and how our major opponents opponent countries stand now in that question?
We're doing well. I mean, if that's the race, we're winning that. No, because, yeah. Well, it's a combination of having a relatively high rate of immigration and relatively high fertility. So, you need like 2.2, 2.3 total fertility rate in order to reproduce the population. And we're a little over 2, whereas, Italy, Spain, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea are like at 1, you know, close to 1. China is it's low, and in another 10 or 15 years, its population is going to start to decline, and it's going to decline even more rapidly than Japan's is declining. Russia has been losing about 700,000 people per year. You know, I mean, in the last few years, they finally managed to stem that loss a little bit, and they've raised their fertility rate a little bit. But, you know, the health outcomes in Russia are awful. I mean, the male life expectancy had been, you know, in the high 60s or low 70s in Soviet times. It's now in the high 50s. So the death rate, especially among Russian men, is extremely, the mortality is extremely high. And their birth rate is very, very low. And so, and Putin has talked about this. I mean, he's saying Russians need to have more babies because, you know, as a country, they're disappearing. The trouble with all of these demographic issues is that you can see them coming, but they come at this glacial pace. And so you know pretty much, you know, what the population of these different countries is going to be in another 25 years, but it's going to take 25 years to actually get there. But it's not just Japan. I mean, all of Asia has now gotten onto this extremely low sub-replacement, you know, growth path, and it's going to have, you know, nobody short of a major plague or war, no society has ever, you know, gone through this kind of population decrease in history, and we don't know how societies are going to deal with this.
One more question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, when you were here 20 years ago, and I did hear you at that time,
Very good.
you were very optimistic because you saw Western democracies spreading, and
Yeah.
you said Western democracies are the one form of government that really validated everyone in the country. And now you sound a
Yeah.
little bit less optimistic. It almost sounds like the Saddam Hussein model might have been better than whatever we
Well.
left in Iraq.
Yeah, I would never say that. No, I mean, so I guess what's different is, you know, I've changed my views in certain ways, and I think the world has changed. So, you know, the one thing that I think is reflected in these 2 books that I've just written is the fact that although I think the democratic idea remains just as powerful as ever. And you can see this, you know, in Hong Kong or Ukraine or Turkey or Brazil. You know, there's a lot of desire for it. What's really, really hard is institutionalizing that desire for democracy and turning it into actually effective democratic government. That's what's really hard. And I didn't appreciate how hard that was back then. But I think the world has changed also, you know, and so it turns out that unregulated you know, financial markets are not self-regulating, you know, and they blew up. They blew up both here and in Europe. You know, and I think actually when I think about the last decade and a half, you know, the 2 biggest events, you know, have really been the Iraq War and the financial crisis. And in both of them, you know, some basic American policies were implicated, and you just got to learn from that experience, I think. So that's why I think, you know, if I don't sound as optimistic today as I did 20 years ago, you know, those are the reasons why.